The ancient stone tower stood like a broken finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Perched on the edge of the forgotten cliffs, it was a place where the world seemed to end, a fitting prison for the woman they called the Harbinger of Doom. Lyra had been in the tower for 372 days. She counted each one with a small scratch on the wall beside her pallet, each mark etched with a fingernail worn down to the quick. The magical chains that bound her wrists glowed with a sickly blue light, humming faintly whenever she tried to access her power. They allowed her just enough energy to survive but not enough to escape, or to end her own suffering. "Your dinner, witch," grunted the guard, sliding a wooden tray through the small opening at the bottom of the iron-bound door. Captain Thorwell was a hard man with weather-beaten skin and eyes that had long ago lost any capacity for compassion. He was her most frequent visitor, though visit implied something far more pleasant than his cold, dutiful appearances. 3 more days until the full moon, Thorwell reminded her unnecessarily. "King Aldrich has ordered that your execution be carried out at midnight. The royal executioner has been practicing." His lips curled into what might have been a smile on another face. "They say he's found a way to keep you conscious even after the first 3 cuts." Lyra didn't respond. She had stopped begging months ago, had stopped explaining that her prophecy had been misunderstood. The vision that had sentenced her to death, the fall of the kingdom of Valoria, had not been a threat but a warning. Yet fear makes monsters of those who should listen most carefully, and King Aldrich had declared her a traitor to the realm. When the guard left, Lyra forced herself to eat the stale bread and watery stew. She needed strength, even if only to face her end with dignity. As she ate, the familiar pressure began building behind her eyes, the precursor to a vision. The chains tightened in response, burning against her skin, but they couldn't completely suppress what was coming. The world around her blurred, replaced by flashes of fire and stone. She saw the great towers of Valoria's capital crumbling, heard the screams of the innocent. But through the chaos, something new appeared, a man she had never seen before. He stood in a library, surrounded by ancient texts, his finger tracing a symbol that matched the curse mark branded on her shoulder. His eyes, warm and determined, seemed to look directly at her across the divide of vision and reality. "Find me," she whispered, though she knew it was futile. No one was coming for her. No one even knew she was here, save for the king and his most trusted advisors. When the vision faded, Lyra found herself on the floor, the chains pulled taut. A fresh burn circled her left wrist where the magic had reacted most strongly. Outside her small window, storm clouds gathered over the distant mountains. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days until the executioner's blade. She closed her eyes and tried to recall the face from her vision. There had been something about him, a quality she hadn't seen in another human being since her imprisonment, compassion. But visions were fickle things, often showing what could be rather than what would be. "If you exist," she murmured to the phantom man, "you're too late." As night fell over the tower, Lyra wrapped herself in the thin blanket provided by her captors. The wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls, carrying the first drops of a coming storm. Far below, waves crashed against the cliffs, a constant reminder of how isolated she truly was. In the darkness, the mark on her shoulder, the one that had appeared the day of her prophecy, began to pulse with heat. Death's mark, they called it. The sign that the gods themselves had judged her unworthy of life. But as sleep finally claimed her, Lyra dreamed not of death but of freedom, of running through sun-dappled forests with unchained hands, of speaking truth without fear. And somewhere in that dream, the man from her vision walked beside her, his presence a promise she dared not believe. Professor Marcus Whitmore's colleagues at the Royal Academy called him obsessive. Behind his back, some used harsher terms, delusional, perhaps even dangerous. But Marcus had long ago stopped caring what others thought of his research into ancient prophecies and their interpreters. "You're chasing ghosts again, Whitmore," Professor Ellington remarked, leaning against the doorframe of Marcus's cluttered office. Scrolls and leather-bound tomes covered every surface, with particular attention given to a collection of texts about the Oracle of Valoria, texts that should have been locked in the forbidden archives. Not ghosts, Marcus replied without looking up from the ancient manuscript he was deciphering. Something much more tangible. His finger traced a symbol on the yellowed page, a curved line intersected by 3 straight ones. The same symbol that had appeared in his dreams for the past 17 nights. The king has forbidden research into the Harbinger, Ellington warned, lowering his voice. They say even speaking her name brings misfortune. Marcus finally looked up, dark circles under his eyes betraying his lack of sleep. Her name is Lyra. And what if the king is wrong? What if she wasn't prophesying destruction but trying to prevent it? Ellington's face paled. Those are dangerous words, my friend. The kind that end careers, or lives. After Ellington left, Marcus returned to his translation. The text described an ancient ritual of binding, specifically designed for oracles whose visions were deemed too dangerous. The binding chains not only imprisoned the physical body but restricted the seer's ability to communicate their visions clearly. The more they struggled, the more distorted their messages became. They weren't just silencing her, Marcus whispered to himself, they were ensuring she couldn't be understood even if someone listened. That night, the dream came again, more vivid than ever. A stone tower on a cliff edge. A woman with eyes that shifted color like opals, her wrists bound by glowing chains. She was looking directly at him, her lips forming words he couldn't hear. But this time, something new appeared, a full moon rising over the tower, and below it, a procession carrying execution tools. Marcus woke with a gasp, the symbol from his research burning in his mind. He knew now it wasn't just a scholar's curiosity driving him, it was something deeper, something that felt like destiny. 3 days later, Marcus stood at the docks of Port Westerly, hiring a boat to take him to the Forgotten Cliffs. The fisherman looked at him as though he were mad. Nobody goes to the Wraith Tower, sir, the man said, spitting over the side of his weathered vessel. Evil place. They say a witch is kept there, one who sees the end of days. I'll pay double your usual fee, Marcus replied, sliding across a pouch of gold coins that represented most of his savings. The journey took a full day, the small boat fighting against choppy waters and an increasingly violent storm. As darkness fell, the tower came into view, a jagged silhouette against clouds illuminated by lightning. The full moon, when it occasionally broke through the storm clouds, cast an eerie glow over the scene. This is as close as I get, the fisherman said, stopping his boat 100 yards from the narrow strip of beach at the base of the cliff. There's a path cut into the rock. I'll wait until sunrise, no longer. The climb nearly killed Marcus 3 times. Rain-slick stones gave way beneath his feet, and twice he had to press himself against the cliff face as guards patrolled above. But something pulled him forward, the same force that had brought him here from his comfortable academic life. When he finally reached the tower entrance, he found it guarded by a single man, Captain Thorwell, though Marcus didn't yet know his name. The guard was huddled under an overhang, sheltering from the worst of the storm, his attention focused on staying dry rather than watching for unlikely intruders. Marcus had come prepared. From his pack, he withdrew a small crossbow, not a weapon he'd ever imagined using, but necessity had made him practical. The sleeping draft coating the bolt wouldn't kill, merely ensure a few hours of uninterrupted access. The guard slumped to the ground without raising an alarm. Marcus found the ring of keys at his belt and began the final stage of his journey, up the winding stairs to the top of the Wraith Tower, where a woman marked for death awaited execution at midnight. I must be mad, he whispered to himself as he climbed. Risking everything for someone I've never met, based on dreams and forbidden texts. But as he reached the door to the highest chamber, as he heard the faint sound of chains shifting on the other side, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. He inserted the key with trembling hands and pushed open the door to face his destiny. The door creaked open, and for a moment, neither moved. Lyra stood at the room's center, chains pulled taut, her posture a mix of defiance and disbelief. Marcus remained frozen in the doorway, the lantern in his hand casting long shadows across the stone floor. "You're real," Lyra whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I saw you in my visions, but I didn't believe." Marcus stepped into the chamber, his scholarly mind cataloging details despite the urgency. The oracle was thinner than in his dreams, her copper-colored hair matted and dull, but her eyes, those impossible eyes that seemed to shift between green and blue and violet, were exactly as he'd seen them. "My name is Marcus Whitmore," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've come to," he hesitated, suddenly aware of how absurd it sounded. "I've come to free you." A bitter laugh escaped Lyra's lips. "You're too late. The executioner arrives at midnight." She raised her bound wrists, the magical chains humming with energy. "And unless you can break enchantments cast by the king's most powerful mages, I remain quite thoroughly imprisoned." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The storm was intensifying, as though nature itself recognized the gravity of what was unfolding within these walls. "I've studied your chains," Marcus said, setting down his pack and removing several small vials and a leather-bound journal. "The binding ritual can be undone, but it requires—" He swallowed hard. "It requires the blood of a willing sacrifice." Lyra's eyes widened. "You would bleed for a stranger? Based on what, dreams? Academic curiosity? Based on the belief that no one deserves to die for speaking the truth," Marcus replied, meeting her gaze. "Your prophecy about Valoria's fall, I don't think you were threatening the kingdom. I think you were trying to save it." For the first time in over a year, Lyra felt something like hope flickering in her chest. The vision was a warning. "A great calamity approaches, not because of my words, but because of what lies beneath the palace itself. A power the king's ancestors imprisoned centuries ago, stirring now as the magical seals weaken." As she spoke, the chains tightened, sending visible currents of blue energy across her skin. She gasped in pain but continued. "They bound me because truth is dangerous to those who profit from lies." Marcus worked quickly, mixing ingredients from his vials into a small clay bowl. "The dissolution ritual requires timing, it must be completed during what the ancients called the hour of unmaking." "The moment between one day and the next," Lyra nodded. "Midnight. The same hour they planned for your execution," Marcus said grimly. "Not a coincidence, I imagine. The magical boundaries are thinnest then." From below came the sound of voices, multiple men ascending the tower stairs. The sleeping draft hadn't lasted as long as Marcus had hoped. "They're coming," Lyra whispered, panic edging into her voice. "You should go. There's still time for you to escape." Marcus ignored her, focusing on completing the mixture. "Faith in prophecy requires accepting one's role in it," he said, almost to himself. Then, looking directly at Lyra, "I didn't come all this way to leave without you." With a small knife, he sliced his palm, allowing blood to drip into the mixture. The concoction began to smoke, giving off a scent like burned copper and lightning. Marcus dipped his fingers into it and began tracing symbols on Lyra's chains, his blood mingling with the potion to create glowing sigils that seemed to sink into the metal. The voices grew louder. Heavy footsteps on the stairs, angry shouts. "If this works," Marcus said, his voice tense with concentration, "be ready to run." I secured a boat at the base of the cliff. The midnight bell began to toll from somewhere distant, the village across the bay marking the hour that should have been Lyra's last. As the final chime faded, Marcus pressed his bleeding palm against the central link of the chains and spoke words in a language so ancient that even Lyra, with all her knowledge of the mystical arts, barely recognized it. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the chains began to vibrate, their blue energy turning violet, then crimson. Lyra cried out as the magic surged painfully through her body, and then, with a sound like shattering glass, the chains broke apart and fell to the floor in pieces. The door burst open. Captain Thorwell stood there, sword drawn, 3 guards behind him. His eyes widened at the sight of the broken chains, then narrowed with fury. "Treason," he snarled, advancing into the room. "You'll die alongside the witch." But Lyra was no longer defenseless. For the first time in a year, her power flowed freely. She raised her hands, and the very air seemed to ripple between her and the guards. Not an attack, she had never been violent, but a momentary distortion of perception that left the men disoriented and confused. "Now," she shouted to Marcus, grabbing his hand. They rushed past the stumbling guards, down the winding stairs. Behind them, Thorwell's voice roared orders, but the confusion Lyra had caused bought them precious seconds. As they reached the base of the tower, rain lashing their faces, Marcus pulled Lyra toward the cliff path. "Trust me," he shouted over the storm. Hand in hand, the scholar and the oracle fled into the night, the chains of fate broken behind them but the consequences of their defiance only beginning to unfold. Dawn broke reluctantly over the whispering forest, pale light filtering through dense canopy to touch the faces of the exhausted fugitives. Marcus and Lyra had traveled through the night, abandoning the fisherman's boat after reaching the mainland and striking inland where the king's soldiers would have difficulty tracking them. "We should rest," Marcus said, noticing how Lyra trembled with each step. Despite her determination, a year of imprisonment had taken its toll on her body. "There's a hollow beneath those roots. It will conceal us for a few hours." The makeshift shelter, formed where an ancient oak had partially uprooted during some long-ago storm, offered just enough space for them to huddle out of sight. As Lyra sank to the ground, her back against gnarled wood, Marcus retrieved a small bundle of provisions from his pack. "Scholarly preparations," he explained, offering her dried meat and a flask of water. "Though I confess I didn't plan much beyond breaking you out of that tower." Lyra accepted the food with grateful hands still raw from the chains. "Most people run away from prophesied doom, not toward it," she observed, studying his face in the dappled light. "Why did you really come for me, Professor Whitmore?" Marcus paused, considering his answer carefully. At first, it was academic, a historian's desire to preserve knowledge being destroyed by fear. But then the dream started. He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "The visions," Lyra nodded. "I sent them, though I didn't know if they would reach anyone. The chains limited my power, but during the full moon, the boundaries between minds grow thinner." "You called me across dreams," Marcus said softly, "but that doesn't explain why I answered." Before Lyra could respond, a sound froze them both, the distant baying of hounds. The king's hunters had picked up their trail more quickly than expected. "We need to move," Marcus urged, gathering their meager supplies. "The forest grows denser to the north. We might lose them in the undergrowth." As they resumed their flight, Lyra's steps seemed lighter, her movements more fluid. Marcus noticed the change, how the farther they got from the tower, the more her natural grace returned. More striking was the change in her eyes. The shifting colors now swirled more vividly, sometimes gleaming with an inner light when sunbeams touched her face. "Your powers are returning," he observed as they paused by a stream to refill the water flask. Lyra nodded, extending her hand over the water's surface. The liquid rose in delicate spirals, dancing between her fingers before falling back. "With each mile, I feel more of myself awakening. What they took from me is returning, but differently." "Different how?" "Before, my visions came chaotically, overwhelming, fragmented glimpses of possible futures. But now..." She looked up at the forest canopy, where light and shadow played among the leaves. "Now I can call them forth deliberately, direct them like threads in a tapestry." The hounds bayed again, closer this time. They pushed deeper into the forest, where thorny underbrush tore at their clothes and ancient trees grew so closely together that they had to squeeze through narrow gaps. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Marcus knew the hunters wouldn't give up easily, not when the king believed his very kingdom hung in the balance. As dusk approached, they reached a small clearing dominated by a circle of standing stones. Moss-covered and weathered, the monoliths radiated an energy that made the air feel heavy with anticipation. "A seeing circle," Lyra whispered, approaching the central stone. "Built by the Old Ones to amplify visions of what might come." Marcus watched as she placed her palms against the tallest stone. Immediately, the clearing seemed to darken, though the sun hadn't yet set. The air between the stones shimmered like heat rising from summer roads. "What do you see?" he asked quietly, reluctant to disturb her concentration but desperate to understand what they were fighting for, and against. "I see Valoria," Lyra replied, her voice taking on a resonant quality that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. "I see what lies beneath the palace, a creature of shadow and hunger, bound by the first king but stirring now as the magical seals fade. If it awakens fully, it will consume not just the kingdom but everything for 100 leagues in all directions." Marcus stepped closer, drawn by the intensity of her words. "This is what you tried to warn them about? This is why they imprisoned you?" "Yes," she nodded, still connected to the vision. "But there's more now, something I couldn't see before." Her fingers traced patterns on the ancient stone, following invisible currents. "The creature can be rebound," the seal strengthened, "but only during the celestial alignment that occurs once every century." "When?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 3 days from now," Lyra confirmed, finally breaking contact with the stone. As she turned to face him, her eyes glowed with otherworldly light. "We have 3 days to reach the capital and convince the very king who sentenced me to death that I'm the only one who can save his kingdom." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. But as night fell over the forest, as the sounds of pursuit faded temporarily into darkness, a strange sense of possibility settled between them. What had begun as a rescue, one scholar's defiance against unjust authority, had transformed into something far greater. "We should move on," Marcus said after they'd rested briefly. "The hunters will use the darkness to close the distance." As they prepared to leave the stone circle, Lyra suddenly gripped his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "There's something else, a presence." From the tree-line emerged a figure, not one of the king's hunters but a woman dressed in the green and brown leathers of a forest dweller. She carried a bow but kept it undrawn, her weathered face showing caution rather than hostility. "My name is Eleanor," she said, stepping into the clearing. "I serve as guardian of these stones." Her gaze fixed on Lyra. "The circle has been dormant for generations, yet tonight it sings with power." A thin smile crossed her face. "It seems the old prophecies about the chained oracle weren't merely stories after all." New hope sparked between the fugitives. They had found, if not an ally, then at least someone who might listen, someone who understood that not all who defied kings were enemies of the realm. The capital city of Valoria rose from the plains like a monument to human ambition, white stone walls encircling elegant spires that caught the morning light. Under different circumstances, Marcus might have appreciated its beauty, but today he saw only the formidable barriers between them and their goal. "The city gates will be watched," Eleanor warned, guiding them along a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the capital. After their meeting in the forest, the Guardian had become an unexpected ally, leading them through hidden paths known only to her people. "Every guard will have descriptions of you both." Lyra stood silent, her gaze fixed on the royal palace at the city's center. Even from this distance, she could feel the malevolent energy pulsing beneath it, growing stronger by the hour. "We don't have much time," she said finally. "The alignment begins at sunset." "Then we won't use the gates," Marcus said, unfolding a weathered map Eleanor had provided. "The old aqueducts enter the city from the west, mostly abandoned now but still passable. Their plan was desperate, born of necessity rather than confidence. Eleanor would create a diversion at the main gate, drawing attention away from the western approach. Meanwhile, Marcus and Lyra would enter through the aqueducts and make their way to the palace, where they would somehow convince King Aldrich that the woman he had condemned as a traitor was actually his kingdom's only hope. As they prepared to separate, Eleanor pressed something into Lyra's hand, a small stone pendant carved with the same symbol that had marked Lyra's shoulder. "My grandmother spoke of the oracle who would be chained and then freed," she said softly. "She said when the oracle returns, the world stands at a crossroads." The aqueduct passage proved more treacherous than anticipated. Decades of neglect had left sections collapsed, forcing them to wade through knee-deep water and squeeze through narrow gaps. By the time they emerged into the lower city, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. "We have less than 2 hours," Marcus said, glancing at the sky as they hurried through back alleys, cloaks drawn tight to conceal their faces. They were halfway to the palace when the alarm bells began ringing throughout the city. Whether Eleanor's diversion had been discovered or someone had spotted them, the result was the same: the streets suddenly flooded with guards. "This way," Lyra whispered, pulling Marcus into a narrow passage between buildings. Her newfound connection to her powers guided her through the labyrinthine streets, sensing paths of least resistance. But as they approached the palace perimeter, their luck failed. A patrol rounded the corner directly ahead, led by none other than Captain Thorwell, his face twisted with vengeful determination. "The witch and her accomplice," he shouted, drawing his sword. "Seize them." What happened next would later be described by witnesses as either miracle or proof of dark magic, depending on their loyalties. As the guards rushed forward, Lyra raised her hands, and the very air around them seemed to fold. Not an attack, she created an illusion, a perfect mirror image of the street continuing empty ahead while she and Marcus slipped into a servant's entrance to the palace. "That won't fool them for long," she warned as they hurried through torch-lit corridors. "And it's depleted much of my strength." Indeed, Marcus could see the toll it had taken. Lyra's face had paled, and the glow in her eyes had dimmed. But determination still drove her forward as they navigated through the palace, following the pull of the malevolent energy to its source. They found the entrance to the ancient chamber in the palace's oldest section, a heavily guarded door that might as well have been a wall for all their chances of passing through it. As they concealed themselves behind a pillar, considering their options, fate intervened in an unexpected form. The door opened, and King Aldrich himself emerged, flanked by his advisors. Even at a distance, the fear on their faces was evident. Something had changed, something had frightened even those who held power over an entire kingdom. "It's breaking free," one advisor said, voice trembling. "The seals are failing faster than we predicted." "Then strengthen them," the king demanded, though his command carried more desperation than authority. "We've tried, Your Majesty. Our mages have exhausted themselves, but this magic is older than our understanding. It requires knowledge we no longer possess." As the group moved away, continuing their urgent discussion, Marcus and Lyra exchanged glances. The door to the chamber stood momentarily unguarded, an opportunity that wouldn't come again. They slipped inside, locking the door behind them. The chamber beyond was vast, circular, its walls covered in ancient symbols that glowed with fading blue light. At its center, a perfect circle had been carved into the stone floor, filled with what appeared to be liquid shadow, roiling and shifting as though alive. "The prison," Lyra whispered, approaching cautiously. "The creature that devours magic and life itself. The first king trapped it here after it nearly destroyed the early settlements." Marcus stared in horrified fascination. "What exactly is it?" "A void fragment, a piece of the nothingness that exists between worlds. It cannot be destroyed, only contained." She knelt at the edge of the circle, examining the failing seals. "And the containment is almost gone." Behind them, pounding started on the door. Their absence from the city streets had been noticed, their location discovered. They had minutes at most. "Can you fix it?" Marcus asked, his scholar's mind racing to connect what he'd learned from ancient texts with the reality before him. "Not alone," Lyra replied. Her hands hovered over the seals, tracing their patterns in the air. "The original binding required 7 mages. I have power enough for perhaps 2 of them." The pounding grew louder, the door beginning to splinter. "Use me," Marcus said, kneeling beside her. "Like with the chains. Take what you need." Lyra turned to him, her shifting eyes wide with concern. "Marcus, this isn't a simple blood offering. It would forge a permanent connection between us, between our life forces. And it might not be enough." The door crashed open. Guards flooded in, led by Captain Thorwell and, behind him, King Aldrich himself. Swords were drawn, crossbows aimed. "Stop them," the king commanded. "The witch means to release the darkness." "No!" Lyra shouted, rising to face him. "I'm trying to save you from it." For a suspended moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the seal in the center of the floor fractured. Black tendrils of not-quite smoke rose from the circle, reaching hungrily toward the nearest life forms. A guard screamed as one touched him, his body seeming to wither before their eyes. Chaos erupted. Guards retreated toward the door while the king stood frozen in horror. And in that moment of confusion, Marcus grabbed Lyra's hand, pressing her palm to his chest, over his heart. "Do it," he said simply. "Whatever it takes." Their eyes met, the scholar who had risked everything on a dream and the oracle whose visions had brought her nothing but suffering. Until now. Lyra's free hand pressed against the primary seal stone. Power flowed through her, drawn from Marcus's life force, from his willingness to sacrifice. The connection between them glowed golden in the chamber's dim light, not a taking but a sharing, a perfect balance of giving and receiving. The fractured seal began to reform, blue light strengthening as Lyra chanted words in the ancient tongue. The shadow tendrils recoiled, drawn back toward their prison. But it wasn't enough, the seal needed more power than even their combined life forces could provide. That's when King Aldrich stepped forward. Perhaps it was witnessing the creature's true nature, perhaps it was finally seeing through his own fear. Whatever the reason, he approached the circle and held out his hand to Lyra. "My kingdom," he said hoarsely. "Take what you need to save it." Lyra clasped his hand without hesitation, completing a triangle of power. The royal bloodline carried old magic, magic that had helped create the original seals. With this final addition, the circle of containment flared brilliant blue, then white, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the shadow was gone, trapped once more beneath symbols that now pulsed with renewed strength. The seal had been remade, stronger than before. Silence filled the chamber as everyone processed what had occurred. It was the king who broke it, turning to Lyra with eyes that held remorse instead of hatred. "I misjudged you," he said quietly. "Your prophecy wasn't a threat." "It was always a warning," Lyra replied, exhaustion evident in her voice but a small smile playing on her lips. "One that has now been heeded." In the days that followed, much changed in Valoria. The king publicly pardoned Lyra, acknowledging the grave injustice she had suffered. The mark on her shoulder, once seen as death's claim, faded to a pale scar, its power broken along with the chains that had bound her. Marcus was offered a position as royal historian, with specific mandate to restore the knowledge that fear had nearly erased. Together with Lyra, who became the king's trusted advisor on matters mystical, they established a new order of seers, those who would watch for dangers and opportunities alike in the kingdom's possible futures. As for Eleanor, she continued to guard the ancient places, though now with the crown's blessing rather than in defiance of it. The old ways and the new-found balance, just as Marcus and Lyra had found balance in each other. On the first anniversary of her liberation, Lyra stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the kingdom she had saved. Marcus joined her, their hands finding each other as naturally as breathing. "Do you still have visions?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, leaning against him. "But they've changed. Before, I saw only endings, now I see beginnings as well." "And what beginning do you see for us?" Marcus asked, his voice soft with hope. Lyra smiled, her eyes reflecting the countless possibilities that lay before them, no longer chained by fate but free to write their own destiny. "That," she said, "is something even an oracle cannot fully predict. And I wouldn't have it any other way."